So the general agenda for today, we have an hour together, you guys, which I'm hoping is enough time, but as these things normally go, sometimes we get more questions, which is wonderful. So we're going to do our best, but the general format that we're going to follow is once I'm done giving this intro, I will hand it over to Susana, who's going to kick us off with approximately, give or take, a 15-minute presentation to just really get us all on the same page when it comes to the European Accessibility Act. And then following that, we have put in a lot of work to compile kind of the most common questions and also questions that illuminate important parts of digital accessibility and this act. And so we will have a little bit of kind of a panel Q&A. I don't know if you can call it a panel if it's just two of us, but I'm going to go with it. And so I will be asking questions to Susana, and that portion will take approximately 15 to 20 minutes, give or take, thus leaving us a lot of time for your questions. So there's going to be a lot of information coming at you guys over the next several minutes here. So for the Q&A at the end, please utilize the chat function and keep your questions coming as we go through all the information. You know, it won't interrupt us, so no stress there. But the goal here is really like, you know, we have a professional in this space to really kind of guide us, and we want to get as many questions as possible answered. So even if we are unable to get through all the questions today, we will be documenting those questions, and then we will follow up with answers in the follow-up email. Okay, I think that was everything housekeeping-wise that needed to be covered. So with nothing else to do, Susana, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Ellen, and nice to be here. I do not see everyone because my screen is too small, but very good to see that we have a nice lineup, and hopefully this will be not covering everything because that could take days, but at least the highlights of this legislation. So my name is Susana Laurin. I'm the managing director and also chair of the Funka Foundation. We're a small research institution based out of Stockholm. I'm also the representative to the European Union for the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, which are the trade association for accessibility experts globally. And I'm also the chair of the ETSIS and CENELEC Joint Technical Body on e-accessibility, very short and nice name, but that's the group who are mandated to make sure that we have standards and technical specifications to go with the European legislation. So probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life, but and I think kind of the expression herding cats came from this assignment, but it's an interesting work to be done. So everything in I'm doing a lot of strategic work for the Commission, and I've been doing that already since the previous legislation. So anything in EU laws or the European standards that you don't like, it's probably my fault, but it's good to have somebody to point finger at. And I will briefly cover today a little bit about the Act, who is covered, who is in scope of the Accessibility Act, and what is actually in scope or covered in the Act, so really the basics, and where to find requirements if you would like to comply with this law, which I hope you will. Then how do you go about finding it, and how do I actually make sure that my organization or my product or my service is compliant? How do I fix this thing called accessibility now that legislation is coming up? And then, as Ellen said, the Q&A part. So I hope that this will be enough for you to at least kick off the discussion. And I will start with kind of the overall position of the European Union, because where does all this come from, and how does it kind of apply to us in Sweden or elsewhere? Well, all the EU policies on accessibility and disability policies and legislation are based on the UN CRPD. So the Convention of Rights for Persons with Disabilities at the UN level. Not only have all the member states ratified the UN CRPD, but also the EU as an organization, and that's quite unique. So everything the EU is doing in this on this topic should always be based on the UN CRPD. And based on that, the Commission and the trilogue with the Parliament and the Council are deciding on a disability strategy, usually for 5 or 10 years. And now we are in the current strategy has a goal of 2030. But in these strategies, we have flagship initiatives, we have policy decisions, we have research projects, and we have legislation. And during many years, nothing really happened on in the part of digital accessibility. We tried in 2008, stranded the kind of common EU disability legislation because of one country. But in the last couple of years, or lately at least, a lot of things started happening. So in 2017, we got a new procurement directive, or an update of the procurement directive, with much stronger accessibility requirements in the directive. So this is really the kickoff kind of for public sector bodies. And then from 2018, we have the Web Accessibility Directive covering the public sector and bodies governed by public law. So kind of the gray zone where organizations are paid for by taxpayers' money and also have leadership and management that is overseen by the government. And from the decision was made in 2019, but it will not enter into place until next year, the European Accessibility Act, and that is what we're focusing on today. So it's kind of a stepwise approach where more and more of the EU is coming under the umbrella of accessibility. One thing that is important to remember is that there are different kinds of EU laws, mainly regulations and directives. And one of the most famous regulations is GDPR. And a regulation is decided at EU level, and then it applies across member states directly. So it's just, you just have to kind of comply with it, and there's no way out of that. The directives are decided at EU level, and then they are transposed into national law. So that means that each member state is either updating existing legislation to fit with the EU requirements or creating new legislation. And all the accessibility directives that are specific on accessibility, so the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act, which is called an act but is a directive, they are both directives that are transposed into national law. This means that it's possible for each member state not to do less than what is required from the Commission, but they can go beyond. And that is actually sometimes happening, that countries move further than the EU requires in their national legislation. Some people say it's weaker with the directive, and it's kind of semantics. And from a legal standpoint, you could say that it's weaker because it's not exactly the same in all countries. But it also makes it possible for the member states to make sure that the legislation fits with the culture, the tradition, and the way the society works. And I really think it's mostly positive from this point of view. So the Accessibility Act, sometimes people say this is for the private sector. It's not really true. It's for anyone who is a manufacturer, authorized representative, importer, distributor, or provider of certain products and services. So the definition is economic operator. That doesn't mean that you have to be privately owned or even commercial. But the certain products and services part here is important because it's not for everything. It's products that are in scope are computers, operating systems, smartphones, and also payment terminals, self-service terminals like ATMs and check-in machines, electronic terminals for communication, digital TV, and e-readers. So quite wide scope on the product side. And when we come to the services, it's even wider, because here we have electronic communication services, which is super wide, streaming services, and when it comes to transportation, all the digital services, so not the buses and trains themselves, but all the ticketing machines and the information around the transportation is covered. Then ebooks and software and e-commerce, and very widely defined e-commerce. So even if you have mainly you sell something in physical shops, but you also have a possibility to sell online, then that's e-commerce already. And consumer banking services, which of course is also another huge area. So quite wide scope, very ambitious, this legislation. And if I want to know how to meet these requirements or how to comply with this law, where do I go and where do I find the requirements? Well, in the legislation, it's always said who is covered, so the scope, and also what is covered, so what the products and services are. That is all in the legislation. And in the European Accessibility Act, there is also an annex called Annex 1, where the actual accessibility requirements are listed. So you have listed on general requirements, the requirements for products, requirements for services, and then the specific product or service is also mentioned. So everything is in the Act. If you would like even more information on the kind of how do I meet these requirements, what do I do, what's the technical specifications, the nitty-gritty parts, then you need to turn to the European standards. But it's important to remember that the standards are voluntary. You may use them, and I certainly recommend to use them because it's a support tool for industry. But if you can show compliance in another way, you are welcome to do that. This is a common understanding that people mix up the standards and the legislation. But the standards are voluntary. And the standard that everyone is waiting for the update on right now is the EN 301549. This standard already exists since many years, and the current version, 3.2.1, is the presumed conformance for the Web Accessibility Directive, and currently the standardization organizations are updating this and a number of other standards to support the European Accessibility Act. So we are in a situation right now where we have the current standard. It will be updated. It is not yet updated. So people say, oh, what can we do when it's not yet updated and we need to comply with the legislation? Well, you need to read the law because the requirements are actually already in the legislation. So don't sit on your hands. Don't wait for the new EN version to come. Look at the current EN version because that won't go away. That's a good baseline. And if you want more of the details, then read the law, even if it's a long and complicated document. So the recommendation on how to actually move from wherever you are now into compliance, my recommendation is to, well, start as soon as possible, at least start now, because now you are a little bit in a hurry, and just take one step at a time. You can't solve everything in one go, probably. So really a stepwise approach is, I think, recommended. And what we see in organizations that succeed in accessibility is that they do many things, but I've divided it here in 3 points. So first of all, where are we today? I believe that you need an analysis, if you don't already have it, of the current state of your organizational status, your internal resources, what competencies do we have in the team or the teams, what external suppliers do we already have, do they know accessibility or do we need to procure new ones, and really the current state of our website or products or services, whatever it is that you want to make accessible. You need to know where you are to be able to plan for your road to wherever you are going in the next step. So that analysis, I think, is really important. And then usually in many organizations, you discover some kind of gap. And it's usually a gap in competence somehow. And of course, we always recommend training, because I don't think that even if we would be more than happy to support you, I don't think it's a good idea to be totally dependent on external suppliers. That is usually not a good idea. You need internal competence to be able to not only do accessibility as a one-off project, but continuously continue working with accessibility. And also when you choose your suppliers, you need to have competence to pick the right one. So internal competence is extremely important. So training is a good thing. IAAP provides professional certification that is very good, and if you don't have that skill set yourself, then at least when you are choosing and selecting your suppliers, make sure to ask for certification from them so that you know that they are knowledgeable in accessibility. And I also think that in most organizations, it's extremely important to have buy-in from management. If your leadership doesn't want to do this or don't understand that they need to provide resources for accessibility, it's very hard to succeed, no matter if you are extremely engaged yourself. So management buy-in, I think, is an important thing. And then the third step would be to make sure that you have procedures and routines in place, that you have a good workflow, and that you document what you're doing, and that you decide on what standards you're going to work on and try to meet. Because when accessibility fails, it's usually that we do what we always have done, and then we realize, oh, this is not accessible, and then we need to remediate afterwards. That is expensive, cumbersome, boring, and usually don't get as far as if you would have done it right from the start. So really have a workflow where you know who is responsible, when do we do testing, when do we need to do external audits and so on. That is extremely important to succeed. If you kind of go through these steps, I think you have a good chance of meeting the requirements and also make your products and services better for everyone. Because even if this is a legislation and you can't opt out of it, the whole idea from the legislator's point of view, and it's also written very beautifully in the Act, is to maximize the foreseeable use. And to me, this is much more important than whether there's a law or penalties or blah, blah, blah. I understand that's important, but really it's about making your product or service as useful as possible for as many people as possible in different contexts and situations, maximizing the foreseeable use. So this is kind of the positive message. I think it's sometimes needed when you talk about legislation, because people get very depressed with rules and regulations that they need to follow. But if you think about this, then I think accessibility can be something positive for you. So that's what I had. Thanks for listening, and I think I kept time.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. And for those of you who joined during the initial presentation, we're now going to head into a sequence where we have some prepared questions to ask Susana. But please, as I see some of you have already done, as your questions come up, add them to the chat because we can fold them into the conversation and then make sure we have time at the end to answer all of them. So please feel free. Throw any questions right into that chat. So with that being said, one of the things you touched on that I would love to hear a little bit more about that I know a lot of our clients really struggle with is this concept of leadership buy-in. And so I am wondering if you could expand a little bit on maybe some tips, if you have them, just recommendations on how to navigate the situation where you're trying to get leadership buy-in. Like how can people who are really passionate about this and see the importance convince their leadership to see that as well?
So, I mean, it depends on the sector and the size of the organization and so on and so forth. But I would say the first step is get a friend. It's very hard to be the only one. So try to at least have a colleague that wants to do this with you. But for management, I would say, I mean, in some organizations, really, this is the law, we have to do it. That is the only thing you need to get the management on board. And then say there will be penalties. And I mean, it's very strong in the Act that if you are not compliant and then the surveillance authorities tells you to remediate something and you don't do it in a timely manner, then your product can actually be taken off market. That's kind of a big thing for many companies. But I think it's often more useful to talk about positive things. I personally haven't really seen many people jumping out of bed in the morning and say, oh, today I'm not going to break the law. I don't think that is the driver. So I would rather talk about maximizing the foreseeable use and talk about we have maybe the product or service is also somehow targeting not only the super young tech savvy people, but I mean everyone from 45 or upwards, they are not super good, or we are not super good in the new technology, and we get lower eyesight and hearing and dexterity and so on. And as we age, we will all, I mean, if we live long enough, we will all have some kind of disability. So not seeing it as this is like a super small group that we need to do something for, but it's really for everyone. And I mean, many accessibility things are also positive for people who are not native language speakers, or I mean, there's so many different broadening the scope of this. I think is one way of moving forward, because it's really, I mean, it's 15 to 20% of the population potential extra clients buying your product or service. I mean, that should be one way of presenting it as well. And maybe the third type of, depends on who the CEO is or the management, but I mean, it could also sometimes help just to say that this is the right thing to do. This has to do with our, you know, how we are seen in the market. We want to be good guys. This is like a part of our CSR, whatever. That could also be an argument. It really depends on where you are. But I personally kind of, we have been more successful, at least in talking about positive things, that it will become, the product becomes better. So, you know, do it because it's for more people than kind of hitting people in the head with the law. But sometimes that's also useful.
Thank you. That's very clear. And I'm seeing a couple questions come up that also are overlapping with this kind of next category of questions, which is great, because I know a lot of people have confusion or questions about the global coverage and the monitoring and or penalties of this act. So with that kind of genre of questions in mind, can you tell us a little bit about how the EAA impacts other countries outside of the European continent? So for example, companies like, you know, the big global Samsung, Sony, Amazon, you know, they're based maybe in Asia or in the US. How is that monitored? So
this legislation is a bit unique in this field and very ambitious. And it's kind of the cool thing is that it doesn't care where you're headquartered. So if you sell your products and services in the EU, and all of these companies that you mentioned do, then you need to comply. If you want to, you know, be on this market, then you need to comply. And how will it affect? I mean, in the longer run, the EU always talks about the trickle-down effect. So, I mean, hopefully, if Samsung or Amazon wants to sell something in the EU, and therefore they make it accessible, it seems likely that they will then sell the same accessible version of the product or service in other parts of the world as well, because otherwise they have to keep two versions updated. So that seems stupid. So now EU is kind of leading the way. We have the strongest, or we will have the strongest accessibility requirements in the world. Used to be the US for a long time, but now we're actually in the lead. So that's kind of cool. And everyone who wants to, I mean, because it doesn't, again, it's the whole ecosystem, manufacturers, importers, distributors, it doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter where your headquarters. If you want to sell in this market, you need to comply with the legislation. The surveillance is done by market agencies in most countries. Some of them have chosen public sector bodies, but usually it's kind of from the banking services, it's a financial agency or institution, inspection, whatever, and so on. So it's going to be sector specific in most countries, and also national. So in each country, there will be a surveillance system set up if it's not already in place, and they will then make sure that the market players are complying to this. And the penalties can happen because a user is complaining, or because the surveillance agencies is doing the monitoring of you. And so it doesn't have to be somebody actually complaining, but that will be the most probable case. The size of the penalties is also decided at national level. So it's difficult to say exactly what it will be like, but I'm quite sure all the national laws that I've been analyzing so far, and I think it will go across the board, is that it's not like you didn't do this and then bang, here's the fine. It will be a discussion. They need to do a review. Probably some experts will be called in and say, does this comply or not? And then you will have a certain time to remediate. If you don't do that, or if you say, we don't care, then the penalty tool can come up.
Okay. We're getting a couple questions about penalties, which I think you just addressed quite well, but is there anything kind of in addition that people should know or understand about penalties? It sounds like it's not super urgent in the sense that, hey, you're not compliant, now you're going to get this huge fine and you have to pay it tomorrow. But there does need to be a process in place. Are penalties, are they all monetary? Are there different kinds of penalties?
As far as I know, everyone is monetary, and they will be based on how many users are affected, kind of estimation, how severe the issue is, and also the size of the organization, or the value of the product and service in the market. They are kind of defined a little bit differently, but these 3 points should always be there to make sure that they are reasonable. So a small company will pay less than a large company, and kind of a small issue will be fined lower than a large one. And if it's really a kind of a basic accessibility issue that excludes multiple user groups, then that will be seen as more serious. So there will be those 3 kind of points in looking into when they decide on the actions. And I think urgency, well, it's not the police saying you were speeding, so it's not that urgent. But it is urgent because if you haven't started yet, if you are listening to this, I mean, you have less than a year to comply. So, I mean, it's kind of urgent anyway. And you don't want to start with, having this infringement process or something. That would be awful. And also, I think, create badwill in the communities. And probably, the first 5 or 10 that goes into some kind of legal process will probably get quite a lot of media coverage. So I would try to behave in the beginning at least, so you're not the first in line. That would be my recommendation. Yeah.
Not an example of all publicity is good publicity.
No, usually not. Usually not.
So another question that I've heard quite a lot, this is back, you mentioned it a bit in your presentation, but could you go over again the key differences between the European Accessibility Act and the Web Accessibility Directive in terms of kind of scope and requirement and how they overlap?
So the Web Accessibility Directive is already in place. It covers public sector agencies in all member states, and also what is called bodies governed by public law. That could be a private school that is funded with taxpayers' money, or it could be the municipality, the company that is collecting trash, for example, that is usually kind of owned by the municipality, but it is a private company, or not usually, but in many countries it is. Mm-hmm. So that's why I call it the gray sector, because it's not only the 1,000 agencies in Sweden that are really 100% public sector, but there's also a lot of things around. I mean, most dentists, we have a lot of private schools and so on, but they are still funded by taxpayers' money, so they are also in scope. But the what part of the Web Accessibility Directive is much more narrow than the Act, because this is websites, including documents and apps. Full stop. That's the only thing that is covered in this legislation. In the Accessibility Act, it's economic operators, no matter what, if you are private or commercial or whatever, but manufacturer, importer, distributor, authorized representative, or service provider, and then you need to look at the specific products and services covered. So if you are a company that is selling chips, then you are not covered. But if you're a company selling smartphones, you are covered. So this kind of the list of what is in scope is much longer.
Okay. And this, I saw a question pop up from Andre, and I think this this is a good segue here to talk a little bit about kind of who's covered, who's not. And so this question here is, does the legislation also apply to IT systems that are not public to the internet? For example, internal company websites behind a VPN that are used by the company's employees. So like internal tooling for a company.
Unfortunately not. This is a consumer legislation, and I wouldn't call, I mean, this will be, a lawyer would answer this in a much more complex way, but I don't see how you could say that the staff are the consumers of this. There may be situations where you could have an internal system that is a kind of a consumer thing, but normally no, that is not the intention. It's external facing.
Okay, so mostly that B2C, if we think about it.
Yes, B2C, absolutely, yes, that's the...
Okay. And another one is, can we talk a little bit about who is excluded from this? Like specifically who is not included in this law?
Mm-hmm. So if you sell products and services on this list, and if you are a manufacturer, distributor, some of this, but you are what in the EU is called a micro enterprise, meaning that you have less than 10 staff and have a turnover of less than 10 million euros, then you are excluded. So if you are a small company, then you are excluded. You are not part of this whole thing. I still think you should be accessible, but you don't have to.
Okay, thank you. So we got another question here, and I've been seeing this pop up a lot, is different websites using accessibility overlays. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, will companies using these overlays be considered compliant?
Absolutely not. That's not an opinion, that is a fact. Accessibility overlay does not equal accessibility. That doesn't mean that it's forbidden to use overlays as long as they don't fuck up your website, but usually they do. But I mean, you're welcome to spend your money on this, but do not think that makes you accessible. Do not believe these salespeople. That is snake oil.
Crystal clear.
Yes.
No, don't do it.
No, that's a no, yes.
We've gotten a couple questions about this when we're talking to people who are really trying to get buy-in in their organization, and perhaps further study needs to be done. But to the best of your knowledge, have there been any economic evaluations of like increased sales or business benefits for companies when they do become more accessible?
Yes and no. I personally think, I mean, yes, there are. I know the Gari Foundation or association, that is the mobile accessibility organization, providing a lot of good content. I can share a link to them. Gari, they have done and also published a couple of kind of the business case of accessibility type reports, and also from some quite large organizations. So there are those, and also within the European Commission research over the years, there have been plenty of projects research projects trying to show this. I personally find it quite difficult from a scientific point of view, because when you do kind of a revamp of say a website or an app, you usually don't only fix the accessibility problems, you usually do something else as well. And I mean, rightly so, it's much better to do everything at once. So you would do design updates, or you maybe some technical things, or some of the technical changes you do to meet the accessibility requirements also means that it becomes easier to, what do I know, do something else. So really the border between accessibility and usability or just better UX is really hard to draw. But I mean, there exists reports saying that if you do this and this and this, then you will earn more money, sell more, have more satisfied customers or whatever. I still think they're slightly questionable, but I'll be happy to share in the follow. I don't have a list of those reports yet, but I know I have them somewhere, so I'll be happy to share with the follow-up email if someone is interested. I may be wrong. Maybe they're perfect, but I think they're a bit. I think it's a bit difficult to kind of prove that you earn money. I think it's the right thing to do, but yeah.
Perhaps quite nuanced and needs a bit more.
Exactly. Yeah.
Makes sense. While we're talking a little bit about resources, how do you recommend that people stay up to date with evolving accessibility standards and technologies? Like, what kind of go-to resources do you think are really credible?
Well, I always recommend IAAP, of course, become a member of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, or just join all the free things that the organization provides. In Europe, we have kind of what we call the EU program, where we, until now at least, provide everything for free for everyone, which is kind of I don't understand really the business behind that, but we do a lot of events. Just in a couple of weeks, we have an event on the Web Accessibility Directive. So there's a lot of free resources, and if it's kind of done under the IAAP umbrella, you know it's a high quality. Also W3C, which is the global standardization organization working on the WCAG requirements. They're also very, very good, very serious, very nice things, quite a few free resources, or very many free resources, but also webinars and trainings and things. A little disclaimer is that they're very Americanized, so you need to you can learn about accessibility, but if, to make the connection to actually EU law, that's not always super fitting, but very, very good things. Also ITU, the standardization organization, have good resources and also some free courses. And of course, in the Funka Foundation, we do webinars and things like that, but I would start somewhere there. There's a ton of things, but also still quite an immature market. So not everybody who calls himself an expert will be a real expert. So you need to be a little bit picky with who you listen to, but there's a lot of good resources and many good people out there sharing. And it's a very nice community. People do share their knowledge a lot. So yeah. And of course, I mean, if you have time, contribute to the standards. It's a good way. Just following the standards is a very nerdy thing, and you need a lot of time, and most people don't like it. But it's like the definition of standardization work is a sure way to lose friend and put family asleep. And that's not all wrong. So, but I mean, if you really want to know what is going on, it's a very good source is the GitLab we have now for the EN 301549 requirements. It's open to everyone, not only the standardization organizations, and I can share the link to that as well, because there you can see how the work with the standard is evolving and also make comments yourself.
Thank you. And I see some resources being shared in the chat as well, which is fantastic. And in the follow-up that we're going to send to everyone who's in attendance, we've started preparing a list of just useful links as well. So you'll get kind of a dump of resources there. Hey, while we're talking about Funka, I did want to take a second we didn't plan this. Maybe I should have faked it and said we planned it perfectly. But there is a kind of perfect follow-up webinar tomorrow. Susana, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it, but you're going to be leading that one. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes. It was planned before the summer, so I don't remember what I was supposed to do. No, but we have every second Friday, we have a very short free webinar series, and we share something like one idea or one tip, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then a little bit of time for questions. So just a 30 minutes slice of something. But tomorrow I'm going to talk about kind of the other requirements of the Act that usually people don't cover. So not the specifications of how do you do this accessible, but really the documentation, everything around the support services and things like that need to be accessible. So it's kind of an additional, adding a little bit of complexity maybe, but that is something that people often forget about or are not aware. So that we try to kind of package that, and to each of those webinars, we also produce a smart guide, so you get something kind of visual that you can print out and look at if you want to.
Excellent. Yeah. So we will send that out to everyone as well. So you have the snapshot and you can attend that if that is of interest. And I have a prepared question that this is so selfish. I asked this question because I'm really curious about it, and I'm hoping others are curious too. But this is, how can organizations effectively involve users with disabilities in their accessibility testing and the development process? So when we think of UX, you know, like all the user testing and interviews, like what's the best way to do that when it comes to accessibility?
Well, I'm happy you asked the question, because I think really the kind of the way to open the door to people's heads and minds about accessibility is really to meeting people with disabilities and see how they actually interact with your product, because that's when you go, oh, we should have thought about this. so really meeting people with disabilities is kind of an eye-opener to most people. I would say reach out to the disability organizations in your local community or your at national level or wherever you are, and try to make sure to start a good conversation and make sure to tell them that you're interested in their expertise and that you will, of course, offer payment if they would have time to help you. A lot of organizations reach out to people with disabilities and their representative organizations, and then they think that they will be just super happy to come and help for a couple of hours and then go home. I mean, they have better things to do, and if you have a severe disability, then your whole life is about struggling against inaccessibility. And for a person like that to take on their free time to sit and test your bad systems, you have to pay them. So I think it's really about being open-minded and welcoming, and making sure that you, of course, try to make sure you need to have a little bit of knowledge on how to set up this testing so that people can use their own assistive technology and so on. But you can read up on that and just be, if you are like a nice inclusive person and a listening person, then I think it will go well. But it's always better to just do one testing with a person with disability than nothing is important. But I would go to the user organizations if you have problems with that, reaching out, or if you want support. We do have a test panel, and other organizations have that as well. We do charge for that support. We don't just deliver testers, but that's another way of doing it. And you can also get support on how to weigh, how many blind people, how many visually impaired, how many deaf, how do I do that setup? That can be also good to have maybe a discussion with us or somebody else on how to do that. But really the involvement starts with reaching out to the user organizations. There are also communities online and other places you can look.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I have one more prepared question here, and then I'm going to start kind of going through this list on the side. So please continue to add your questions. I think we're going to have a little bit of time for kind of additional nitty-gritty questions. But my last prepared one for you is, what are some cost-effective strategies for small to medium-sized businesses to improve their digital accessibility? You know, if you're not a big enterprise and you're like, okay, we need to kind of hit the ground running, what's kind of a way to get jump started on this work?
Well, I would start with the reaching out to users. That's a good place to start. But I think you need to dive a little bit into the requirements and look at the standards and see what's there. And there are things that are easy to fix, and there are things that are not so easy to fix, and then there are the complicated things. And just try to make a good prioritization and start doing it. It's really the idea of like multimodality. I would say if you don't have time or energy to read the whole EN, I know it's a long document, then just remember this, that you need to make it possible to use the interface with more than one sensory channel. In essence, provide an alternative. When you have a photo, you need to have an alternative text because not all people can see the photo. when you have a video or an audio, you need to have captions because not everyone can hear the content of the video. And that's what it is. It's 200 pages saying that in different ways. It's really, if you think in a multimodal way and think that accessibility is in essence providing an alternative, because not all people have the same abilities to perceive information or operate things with all their senses, then that's a huge step on the way. So if you can just kind of put that into the heads and minds of your designers and developers, then I think that's kind of a good way, a good place to start. And then engage, go training. I mean, open some doors, start somewhere. I think that's take a step. That would be my recommendation. It's a first one.
Don't do nothing. Just start. Dive in.
Don't do nothing. That's good. Don't sit on your hands.
So I'm going to turn to a question here from Pratik, and this one is excuse me, let me start over. Can you please clarify how to map EN 301-549 current version to Annex 1 requirement, as the directive is really generic?
Oh, well, that is that's a very good idea. Somebody should do that. I haven't done it, and I can't just do that on the spot. It's that's a good question. The Annex 1 and the EN standard are not structured in the same way, so it's not possible to just put them side by side, or at least I don't have the brain to do that, and kind of read them like this. That would be a super good thing to do. Thank you for asking that question. But the important part of reading the Act is really to make sure that you read the generic ones, the product or service ones, and then the ones that apply for your specific product and services. I think that is complex enough for most people to do that, and to make sure that that is happening. And then really what the standard does is then just say, if you don't know how to meet this, then we have the standard has kind of the how, the responses to the how, but it's not mapped that way. Unfortunately, somebody should have done that.
Maybe we can use AI to do that after this call. See.
AI and accessibility. It's not. I'm sorry. I'm not against AI in any way, but there's not enough good resources out there for the machine to learn about accessibility. Cheat with whatever you like, but in accessibility, it's not a good idea usually.
Can't shortcut it.
Not with AI, at least. You can. I'm sure you can shortcut it some way, but not that way.
Okay, this next one here that we have not yet covered is a question about grace period. So will there be a grace period between June 2025, when the EAA goes into effect, until a company can receive a penalty?
There are grace periods, but not connected to the penalties. So if you have for example, the self-service terminals, if you had a contract before the law entered into force, then you can use that machine until the end of its economic life, maximum 20 years. And there are a couple of other things like that where there are grace periods. For example, the emergency communication doesn't have to apply until 27 and so on. But it's not connected to the penalties. It's when the actual part of the directive is entering into force. When it comes to when the penalties can occur, that is up to the monitoring agency to kind of declare, and that will depend on how severe the problem is and so on, and probably also a little bit about the tradition in the country, I would say. Some countries will be more like this, and also how you react to it. So being a little bit nice and not creating a conflict is usually a good thing. Just looking at the current legislation, we have been being the experts in court cases all over the world for many years, and it's very clear that when a company says, "Hey, we don't want to do this. We don't believe in this. We are not," and trying to say we don't have those clients, or we don't. stupid idea. That's when it escalates quickly and it becomes really, really hard to kind of get away out from. There are ways around. You can say that it's disproportionate burden. You can say that this is doing this would make sure that we would have to alter the kind of the basic functionality of our product. We really need more time to do this. There is a way to postpone a little bit or to give yourself time if you show that you take it seriously and that you have kind of a good conversation with the surveillance authorities usually. So that would be my recommendation, and not just kind of wait for it to happen.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's take a moment to kind of turn to the future. And this question is, do you think more services will be in scope in the near future?
No.
Interesting.
It takes a long time for the EU system, the trilogue, to create laws, and adding another service into this would require a whole new process like that. And there's no, I don't see that happening before I retire. So no. I think this is what we will have to live with. What could potentially change is, for example, in the Web Accessibility Directive, we have the live videos that are shown live streamed video is excluded from the accessibility requirements. I think that could potentially change, because now the auto captions are getting better and better. So when that all works in all the official EU languages, I could foresee that the Commission could maybe take that exemption out. Things like that could potentially happen. But adding more services, that is very unlikely, and would take a long time.
Okay, interesting. Okay, team, let's see. So we have time for, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. And there's one here that I will ask, and it's from Anahit. And if I ask this incorrectly, please feel free to jump in and correct me. But from my understanding, the question is, the EEA standards for the websites, to comply with, are they the same as WCAG 2.1 AA level?
No. I'm saying no to things today. Sorry. Well, first of all, the European legislation needs European standards, so we can never point directly to WCAG. But the EN 301549 is partly based on WCAG, so it's the same thing, but it's not kind of WCAG. It's the way we have implemented it. So first of all, the current EN 301549 standard is being reviewed and updated as we speak, and we have already added in WCAG 2.2, because that's the WCAG stable standard that is out there now. So when the EN becomes published, it will be WCAG 2.2. But the EN is broader than WCAG alone, so there are also other requirements, what we call EN beyond. Already today in the annex of the EN, Annex A, there is a long list of requirements for the Web Accessibility Directive that is beyond WCAG. So it's almost all the WCAG criteria, and then there are also several other criteria. So it's not enough with just WCAG. But if WCAG is where you feel comfortable and you want to start, then you need to at least add the new criteria that is in 2.2, because that will 100% sure be in the official journal when the 301549 comes out.
Great. Okay, team, that is almost all the time we have. So I want to send a huge thank you to you, Susana, for being here with us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and helping us understand the importance and the depth of this act. And thank you to everyone who attended as well. And like I mentioned before, we will be sending out a follow-up with the recording of this webinar, along with some resources that were discussed today, as well as a few others. And we will also be sharing the link to the event sign up for the webinar with Funka that takes place tomorrow. So if you need to dive a little deeper or you want to dive deeper, you have an opportunity as early as tomorrow. All right, thank you so much, and I hope to see everybody at the next webinar. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.